in other words, resources that are intended to be used where the clinicians encounter their patients and their clients. Drug information resources is another, what you could call class, I guess, of resources. So we'll talk about some of those. We'll talk about reviews. There's a great many reviews in the health literature. A particular type of health resource that you'll hear about often called clinical guidelines. Of course, the ubiquitous grey literature that's out there, and various sorts of research support resources, and then typically what you would expect, things like the databases that are the major databases for the medical and health specialties. We'll talk a bit about the thesauri that are used in those, the core literature, how you define what's core, the role of aggregators in this sort of literature, the scientific, technical and medical publishers, defining what's core, and finally we'll finish up with choose your source. So it's quite a little journey we'll go on today, and I know some of you do already work in health, and some of this may be old news to you, but there are also people, I think, who are new to this field, and so we do need to cover all bases as we go through. Okay, so that's the outline. So we'll move on to the first part of what I said we'd cover, and that's client expectations. So clinical people, doctors, nurses, allied health, health policy makers, they're the sorts of clients that health libraries have, and in the universities they will obviously have also health science students, medical students, nursing students, allied health students, and then there are all sorts of different health libraries. There might be drug company libraries. Clients in general, though, still from all of those sources do expect to be given access to evidence-based resources. So the evidence-based movement's been going for some decades now, based on the fairly sensible suggestion that clinical practice should be based upon the best available evidence, so that everyone's looking for the sources that inform best practice. And of course, they're very busy people in healthcare environments these days, so they're definitely after very rapid and easy access. They want access paths that reflect their different needs. They want to be able to reach things wherever they work. They want from whatever device they choose to connect from. They want platforms that are easy to use, resources that are easy to use, easy to navigate their way around, that get them to the information quickly, and are embedded where they work, so where they can use it on their phone if they're at the bedside, or on a workstation on wheels, which is a common thing that is used at the hospital I work at. You'll see the doctors on the ward rounds, they'll have a workstation on wheels, and they'll be taking notes on that. They'll be looking things up as they go. So that's the sort of environment that we work in. High expectations for high quality, and lots of different modes of getting to things, lots of different interfaces to things, and what they need when they need it, very much so. And of course, evidence is also a bit of a problem, because there's just huge amounts of it out there, which we'll see next week when we start the modules to do with searching. There's just enormous millions and millions of citations in the journal literature, and many hundreds of thousands of books out there that you could conceivably get this evidence from. So volume is definitely a problem in terms of navigating your way to the really good stuff. Paywalls, as always, if they don't approach things through a library site, they're very likely to hit a paywall and then get put off going any further. Whether that sort of evidence is easily available to them at the point of care, and that's sometimes, no matter what the library does, may be outside of our hands. So for instance, wards just may not have enough computers available for people to sit there and look stuff up on the ward, or in the middle of the emergency department. So the problems are not just on the library side in terms of what we're able to do. Sometimes there are environmental factors that affect their capacity to get hold of the information they need where they're actually at their point of practice. Usability of resources is a big issue, so whether they're able to make best use of the resources because of the way in which it's laid out. So you'll find some resources will sometimes have a higher level of uptake and use, and when questioned, people will say, oh yes, that's good evidence in that one, but I like the way it's laid out in this one. So that can be an issue, that, you know, do you go for are they going for what's easy to use rather than whether it's really giving them the best available evidence. And finally, when they're examining the evidence that they're presented with, are they able to take that evidence and then apply it in their clinical setting to a specific patient in front of them? So sometimes the evidence may say, you know, well, in this sort of patient, but you've got that sort of patient, does the evidence still apply? So there's some of the problems that clinicians encounter, and this has been conceptualised by Brian Haynes from McMaster University in Canada, where he was trying to describe the levels of evidence that are out there that clinicians might make use of, and he saw it very much in a pyramid shape. So at the very bottom you've got all of the individual studies, the original articles that are published in journals, and it gets more and more specific and targeted the higher up the pyramid that you go. So at the very peak of the pyramid you would have something like a computerised decision support system, and that means that the evidence that they need is built into the clinical systems that they use. So as they're entering data, or, you know, as they're looking at data, as they're recording their findings with the history they take from the patients, as they're choosing to order tests, or as they're choosing to prescribe drugs, the computerised system will say, hey, you know, you've got an aged person with, you know, this comorbidity. It's not indicated that you should either have this test done or prescribe that drug, because, you know, it's bad practice, and so they're given a little warning from this very clever computerised decision support system. So that's what the pyramid the pyramid indicates would be the peak of helpfulness to a clinician, is to have that built into a system that they're using anyway. But the level of systems that are smart enough to do that is just quite minuscule at this point in time. So generally people are a bit further down the pyramid in terms of the evidence that they're going to be able to get their hands on. And so I guess even at the computerised decision support system level, you would still need some sort of capacity to override, because there may be factors that computerised system still hasn't taken into account that the clinician's aware of. So all of these are systems designed, or sources of information designed to help clinicians, but they don't obviously replace that, you know, intellectual effort that the clinicians got to put in themselves into evaluating whether what they're being told matches the patient in front of them, and the choice even that the patient may make. The patient may, well, okay, the best evidence says that, but I don't want it, says the patient. So, you know, all sorts of things come into, you know, how evidence gets used in practice. But basically that's the sort of idea, that you have this pyramid of evidence, and you're always trying to deliver things to clinicians that are higher up the evidence pyramid. We'll talk about some of these different, well, we've already touched, I think, a little bit on clinical decision support. So just to go back over that point, from a sort of an official sort of a definition of it, as you can see, it's information that provides the staff with knowledge and person-specific information. That's the really important bit, person-specific information that's intelligently filtered or presented at appropriate times to enhance health and healthcare. And there's a whole pile of different sorts of things that could be meant when people say that. It's one of those overarching terms that you've got to drill down to sort of be sure that you're all talking the same thing. Are we all talking about the same thing when we say that? Is it simply something that says when you go to the GP, an alert that pops up and says, oh, your patient hasn't had a tetanus booster for 10 years, you better maybe give them that, or they haven't had their flu needle for this year. So it can be as simple as that, but it can be quite complex as well. So as I say, if you go to order a radiology order or a pathology order, it might pop up and say it's really not indicated for the thing that you're looking for, so you're going to waste money if you order that test or order that X-ray. So that's just going back over that one a little bit. Point of care resources, you can have arguments about whether some of these resources truly are point of care resources. Some of them are, some of them definitely are. So diagnostic imaging pathways is one I'm familiar with from WA, which is something developed from the radiology people in WA Health who have come up with pathways. So, you know, if you're intending to send someone for a CAT scan, they have to have these sorts of criteria if you're looking to, you know, have a diagnosis for that sort of a condition. So that's very much a, you know, a clinical pathway, so I'd call that definitely a point of care resource. PEMSOFT is paediatric emergency medicine. I think the emergency medicine people would probably think of that as a decision point of care resource. But resources such as Access Medicine, which is really a platform of online books from publisher McGraw-Hill, I guess you could argue, is that truly a point of care resource? People do use those big textbooks of medicine to get point of care information. So, what I'm trying to say is some of these things may or may not be, may be arguable whether that one person thinks they're a point of care and another person thinks they're just a publisher platform. Same goes for Clinical Key, which is an Elsevier product, which is a collection of ebooks, e-journals, it does actually have clinical guidelines in it, so I guess you could say from that perspective it's got that element of it is a point of care resource. It's got some drug information in it, so I guess arguably that makes it a point of care resource. Therapeutic Guidelines has information about therapeutic care for patients, so that would be. So what I'm trying to say is that I'd be quite prepared to enter into a debate and, you know, maybe would take out something like Access Medicine from that little set that's shown there. We'll talk a bit more about things like Cochrane a bit later on, and Up to Date a bit later on as well. This is another resource that is used in the UK. I don't know how much of a, not sure if it maybe has made some inroads into Queensland. I think at one point I know some of the health departments around the country were looking at it as a potential resource. But the idea of it is that you buy access to a thing called the Map of Medicine, and it comes with evidence-based clinical practice pathways, and you're able to incorporate your own local pathways into that if you want. I think my understanding was last time I heard there was some dispute about, although you buy it and you pay them enormous quantities of money for it, if you add any pathways in of your own, they took over the intellectual property. Now I'm not sure if that's still the case, because I believe that was a bit of a roadblock to some health departments in considering taking it up, because obviously it's almost like crowdsourcing pathways, and you leverage off, you know, the platform that they're delivering it through, and you leverage off the efforts of a lot of people. Now it's a question of, you know, who do you trust? Do you trust the pathways that have been put in there? Have they been through proper processes to be created and so on? But that I think that's quite an interesting model, and probably has some potential that really hasn't taken off all that widely that I'm aware of in Australia. The other class I mentioned is, and again, I would also call these point of care resources, I guess, but they're a particular group of point of care resources, because these are very definitely intended for use at the bedside, in the clinic, on the wards. And these are the drug information resources, because this is, you know, a really big part, obviously, of healthcare, is making sure people get, you know, drugs that are going to do what they need to do and do no more, and certainly do no harm. And so there's quite a range of resources that are out there that are very, very much core to health information resources in any hospital, in any clinic. Now, some of these resources are even, in a sense, I guess you'd say, mandated. So the Pharmacy Board of Australia has a list of, I think they used to call it recommended reading, but I think they've got another name for it now. But there are certain ones of these that they mandate that you must have, and certainly I know in Western Australia Health, the hospitals are mandated to use the Australian Medicines Handbook. MIMS Online is another very similar sort of resource. Natural Standard, there's an increasing demand for resources that tell you about the adverse effects or the interactions that you may get if you mix so-called natural, homeopathic or over-the-counter vitamins, minerals, so-called alternative medicines, and whether they're going to have any impact on the medicines the doctor knows you're taking. And I think there's been a few cases in the press in the last few months about people who've had complete liver failure as a result of taking some sort of, I can't remember what it was, a protein supplement or something like that, and basically it destroyed their liver. And some of them have terrible interactions with the more sort of pharmaceutically produced drugs. So doctors and clinical pharmacists in particular are really keen to get, you know, lots of evidence about what's known about interactions and adverse effects of so-called natural products. So something like Natural Standard, the National Prescribing Service, medicine-wise, therapeutic guidelines, which we already mentioned, and then poisons information. So any drug, as well as being a good thing, can be a poison, and there are many other substances as well that can be used to that can poison people. And so the poisons information people, who are often, you know, pharmacists or clinical toxicology doctors, they're very much in need of resources such as that. Chem Alert, telling you what's in common household products and so on, in all sorts of material safety data sheets for different chemicals that are in the environment out there in the workplace. So that's another particular group of resources. And then just incredible numbers of reviews. So when people say they're doing a review, you really need to understand what they mean by what sort of review they're talking about. And I do recommend the article that is linked to there for you to have a look at. People even now having to come up with some sort of typology of all of the reviews that are out there. So, and they've identified 14 different review types which have associated methodologies. So, yeah, so maybe have a look at that in the break or after the class or sometime through the next couple of weeks. Just going to take a drink of water. Okay. And of course, in the last few years, the big growth has been in the development of systematic reviews to inform practice. And they're a very different type of review, and unfortunately, the language is used very loosely at times. And when people say they're doing a systematic review and there's one of them and they want it by tomorrow, you tend to think perhaps that's not exactly a systematic review that you're doing there. That might be a literature review, which goes back to that the slide immediately before about all the different types of reviews, but people hear words like systematic review, think that they have to do a systematic review, walk in and ask librarians like us for systematic review, a search to support some systematic review that they say they're doing. But the first question always is it really a systematic review? And we've had a few instances where people have gone off and so-called done their systematic review, written it, and then realised, oh gee, I need a lit search to go with this. So they come back and say, oh, I need a lit search for this systematic review. I finished it, you know, I just need, what's search strategy? And you're going, that's not actually a systematic review. So people need to be a little bit careful with their language, and if they think that that would pass muster as a systematic review, it absolutely wouldn't. A systematic review done properly is a very, very rigidly defined process, and it has lots and lots of standards around it. And the criteria in particular that define a systematic review are those ones with the dot points that you're looking at. So before you begin even looking, you create your set of objectives, you define your eligibility criteria, you come up with an explicit and reproducible methodology, you do a systematic search that attempts to identify all studies that would meet the criteria. So you don't work backwards from now I've done it, I need a search that, you know, proves I've found everything. That's absolutely the wrong way to do it. You need to then do an assessment of the validity of all of the findings. So, you know, some of these things are very big, because if you're searching broadly to pick up anything that might potentially be relevant, you could find yourself wading through hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of references. So it's not something to be undertaken lightly, and certainly for librarians, when we get asked to do systematic reviews, for us that can be a week of work to do one. So we need them to be serious if they're asking us to give them a week of our time to do something that, you know, you really just cannot do it after the fact. And sorry, I should have finished the dot points, but what it finishes up with is a systematic presentation and a synthesis of the characteristics of and findings of included studies. So the reason this came about is that this sort of method of doing a review came about is that a lot of medical studies are done over and over and over again, but in very small numbers. So they may only have, you know, 100 research participants in that study. And so the level of certainty that you can apply to any evidence that emerges from a 100-person study is very, very low. It's a very low bar. You know, you really can't extrapolate from that, you know, the next 100 you're going to see are going to have similar sorts of reactions to the drug or whatever it is that you're studying. They may not have the same sorts of outcomes as the 100 in this little study over here. But the problem is that not everybody sets up these large randomised inter-country, you know, hundreds of thousands of research subjects in them that come out, you know, that got enough power to come out with really definitive findings. So you end up with lots of little studies. So the idea of a systematic review is you take all those little studies, and so long as each of those little studies has the same type of patient population, they have the same type of intervention, whatever that intervention may be, they're measuring the same sorts of outcomes, and they're comparing outcomes in the same way. So long as they're doing all that and they're reporting all that, and you can say, yes, this study is the same as this study, is the same as this study. Now, they may all have slightly different findings from each of those, but if you put them together and you apply very clever statistical analyses to those, you can accumulate all of those little, not very informative studies and get a really reliable or fairly reliable meta-analysis out of it. But you can't do that unless you do it carefully, because otherwise you're just magnifying errors all the way through the process. So it's a big thing in medicine and health, but it's something that has to be done carefully. And our role is preferably to be involved as early as possible in that process, even back to the first step of we're not setting the objectives and defining the criteria, but the better you understand those, the better you're going to be able to do a search that meets that researcher's need. So that's a very particular type of resource and literature, and it's becoming a lot more prevalent. And a lot of it came out of the developments in groups of people around the world who were observing, there's too many small studies, not enough evidence despite the number of studies, and a man called Archie Cochrane began this idea of the Cochrane Library, a database of systematic reviews. So the Cochrane Library is a database of systematic reviews, but it has other parts to it as well. So it has an underlying controlled trials register. So obviously, in order to compare trials, you need to know about the trials. Not all trials get published well or indexed well or are easy to find. So it's got an associated controlled trials portion to the library. But the library itself is the library of systematic reviews, and it had its beginnings in obstetrics, where people were saying, but why does that hospital have such good outcomes and our hospital is not doing so well? What are they doing? What aren't we doing? What's the evidence? How do we improve our practice? So in the early days, the Cochrane Library was very much based in the obstetric literature, but it's expanded into all areas now. And so Cochrane is a particular type of resource in that it's a library of systematic reviews. And of course, all of these are useless unless they're updated. So systematic reviews in Cochrane have a lifespan, and if they're not updated, they'll be pulled off the database eventually, because new evidence is always coming along, and the groups that produce these reviews need to keep them up to date. Now, you can see that resource, or maybe you can't see from that slide, but if you go online to the Cochrane Library, you'll find that you can get into it from anywhere completely free in Australia. And the reason for that is that it's not free because it's now published by Wiley, but it's free to everyone in Australia because the National Health and Medical Research Council pays an annual subscription on behalf of the entire country. It's the only resource that's like that in Australia. So we're very fortunate here to be able to get access to the entire Cochrane Library. And actually, I've just realised I think some of the participants might be from overseas, and I think the link I've put is the direct link. But if you go through the QUT library site, you will be able to, I think you should be able to access it if they've proxied it, or you may find you've got access in your own country, but that's quite a major and core resource that's out there these days. And they're done by an absolute international army of volunteers. So it's people who work in a particular specialty saying, why don't we know what the best practice is for this? Let's see if we can work out what the best practice is by identifying studies that are out there and bringing them all together and seeing whether we can get a reliable statement of outcomes as to whether this does or it does not work. And so these are, and as I say, it's a huge process to do a Cochrane review, to do any systematic review. You follow that same process I talked about a little bit before. And you'll see the little logo for the Cochrane Library. That's called an odds ratio diagram. And that's a sort of a graphical indicator of the strength of the evidence that supports whether intervention is or is not warranted in any particular thing that's being studied. So it's a very interesting resource to have a look at it. And if you haven't looked at it closely, I'd recommend that you do. Of course, that covers the medical side pretty well, but a lot of people were observing that that's quite a good process, and why can't it be expanded as a concept, and so the Campbell collaboration was born, and that also does systematic reviews, but this time they focus more on reviews that look at the effects of social interventions in crime, justice, education, international development and social welfare. So quite a different sort of an approach, and probably a more difficult one in many ways, because the Cochrane collaboration is based on very standardised scientific sort of techniques of randomised controlled trials and standard methods of research, standard scientific methods of research. But of course, when you get into social welfare and education, a lot of the evidence is much more qualitative rather than being quite so quantitative, and so they would have particular difficulties, I think, in doing their systematic reviews, in identifying similar studies and making sure they can accumulate the results of those studies and come up with any sort of indications for good outcomes. But it's really good to see that that whole process is being expanded and into the social sphere, as well as in the purely medical scientific sphere. And as I said, the final process of a systematic review can be the application of a meta-analysis to the evidence that you've found. And again, this is a really rigorous process. So because you're combining results from two or more separate studies, so the potential advantages, as it says, are that you get an increase in power, an improvement in precision, the ability to answer questions that you can't reliably determine from the individual studies, and the opportunity to settle controversies that arise from conflicting claims. But again, they've also got the potential, as good as they can be, to mislead seriously, particularly if specific study designs and so on are not carefully considered. So, and that's something that if you're going to do a meta-analysis, you really need a statistician on your team, because it's a quite complex set of analysis that needs to be done, and you really need to understand lots and lots of stuff about medical statistics to be able to do those. There's another type of research that's also been taken up, because sometimes those sorts of, as I say, very scientific methods don't always work so well when you're talking about if you're just looking to see, is this sort of intervention better than that sort of intervention? You may just be able to, it's a different method of looking at the research that's out there. So they're looking for all available evidence about benefits and harms, and they're like a research review. So it still requires the same level of rigor, and it still requires, high quality evidence to support it. But conceptually, it's seen as a different process and a different type of review, and a lot of that's coming out from this organisation called the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is a US agency that's got a whole section of it that looks at effective healthcare. What is effective healthcare? And then finally, clinical guidelines. They proliferate endlessly, and everybody wants to write clinical guidelines. We were looking at some today that had been done within our health service, and we were finding broken links, and we found that people that we had provided the literature to had taken the references we'd given them and put them at the end of the clinical practice standards that they developed, and then gave those practice standards to a different agency, who then just reused our links, which of course won't work for them, because they'll only work for people in our health service, because they're proxied and they're controlled links to this, to the resources that we subscribe to in our health service, not that aren't subscribed to in the other health service. So, and also just in the first one we checked, of course, was already out of date. So the link was taking them to some guidelines from the Australian Resuscitation Council from 2010. And of course, they've now updated to 2016 guidelines. So clinical practice guidelines are sort of almost like confetti in some organisations, and everyone thinks they can write one. And if they write 15 pages, that's got to be better than writing 1 page, and therefore they're going to write the most comprehensive thing you've ever seen. But of course, I don't think they're often used at the coalface personally. That's what I hear. They're too long, they're not laid out well. So that goes back to that usability thing. Clinical guidelines can be done well, but quite frankly, some of the publishers have a better idea of how to structure stuff than some people who think that they're experts in writing them. But the aim of them is obviously to describe appropriate care based on best available evidence. They want to reduce inappropriate variation in practice. They want to provide a more rational basis for referral. They provide a focus for continuing education. Their objective is to promote an efficient use of health resources, to act as a focus for quality control, including audit. So can you measure practice against a guideline? And to highlight shortcomings of existing literature and suggest appropriate future research. So they've got very laudable objectives behind them, and lots of people put them out. So not only agencies like ours, individual hospitals will put them out, but you'll find that I think I saw new guidelines that are out for the diagnosis of dementia just come out recently. New guidelines in whether you should or you shouldn't screen for bowel cancer. There's every different asthma foundation, heart foundation, gut foundation. They're all busy writing guidelines, and the Australian one writes, Australian agencies write, or Australian Gut Foundation writes them. The UK one does, the US does, Europeans do. So on any one topic, you can probably find about 10 guidelines without looking too far. And I'm not sure that's very helpful particularly. They can also be quite contested. So they are just guidelines and just guidelines, she says. But, the people who've developed them have, sweated blood over producing them, and they don't think they're just guidelines, but they are in fact guidelines, because the patient that presents in front of a clinician may not tick every box that the guidelines were written to represent. So it's a very interesting sort of area of practice, this, when people come and say, I'm writing a clinical practice guideline. To be honest, my heart sinks, because I think, who's going to keep it up to date? Is this going to be done properly? Is it really going to be done systematically? Is there one already out there? Do you really need to reinvent the wheel? Which is why I think the map of medicine is an interesting model. That you leverage, you crowdsource it, and in fact, some people just decide that some of the published resources that are out there by commercial publishers, they're just going to adopt them, because they know they don't have the capacity to keep clinical guidelines updated. But on the other hand, if you're audited and you have an adverse event and the coroner wants to know, why did you do this, I guess it's nice if you've got a clinical practice guideline in your back pocket that says, well, I practiced in accordance with best practice at the time. Yes, there's lots and lots of guidelines out there, and in fact there's whole repositories of guidelines. So the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia has a portal to guidelines. Now they produce some guidelines, probably only a handful really, I think, from the NH and MRC directly, but they, I guess you'd say, kite mark. They will accept guidelines from sources that have been registered with them as being a reliable source of information. So they're not going to accept guidelines from the loony fringe, I'm going to, say magnetic bracelets cure cancer. They wouldn't accept those sorts of guidelines from any old quack out there. That you have to be, a proper medical institution with a good track record behind you, and then if they accept that, and they'll put links to your guidelines through their portal. So that's one way of finding Australian guidelines, would be through the Australian Clinical Practice Guidelines portal from the NH and MRC. There's even an international network that compiles guidelines from around the world and has its own portal to them. If you're a member of that network, if national agencies are members of the Guidelines International Network, you might be able to find your guideline through that portal. And then there's various others. So again, the US has a national guideline clearinghouse, and again they have they don't produce guidelines themselves, but they harvest data about guidelines from agencies like heart foundations, American Heart Association, Cancer Association, those sorts of bodies. So they're, again, just a portal to them, so you link out to I think they reproduce the actual guideline within the National Guidelines Clearinghouse. I see Cecily's, NH and MRC is called for a review of, there definitely are gaps out there. There are too many on some topics and just none on others where there is actually a need for a guideline. And in the UK, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, nice, lovely name. They get all the best names. I love that name. Produces guidance on all sorts of things, and again, that was designed to do all those things that we saw earlier: reduce inappropriate variation in practice, improve clinical practice, all of the things that we saw, improve referral practices, all those sorts of things. And there's lots and lots and lots in there. Now, every now and then there'll be a little flurry of controversy about a guideline. People won't agree with it, and sometimes they get revised, sometimes they get pulled altogether. I know some Cochrane reviews have been withdrawn because they proved too controversial, and people were saying that's not the best evidence, you haven't got the best evidence there. So they can be sources of controversy. Where are we up to? Just have another little drink of water, I think. Okay. And then there are very specialty sources of guidelines. So this one from New South Wales Cancer Institute, Cancer Treatments Online, is adopted by quite a lot of agencies, not just in New South Wales but around Australia, because they have undertaken to keep this site up to date, and so they're trying to give the best possible level of information about cancer treatments and what works and what doesn't, because that's obviously a really rapidly changing field of practice in medicine, and so guidelines in that area in particular need to really be, someone needs to keep an eye on them and keep them up to date, because some things don't change much over time, but something like cancer certainly has a lot of developments happening all the time, and even more, it has a lot of very interested patients wanting to know themselves, because that's quite a serious thing if you get something like a cancer. So there are all the different sorts of sources that we're going to talk about to this point, I think. There's lots of others we'll come back to, but what I thought we might do is to break it up so that you're not just sitting there and listening to me for 2 hours, which I think could be an exercise in sleep for some. We need to mix this up a bit, and I thought it might be useful for you to have a look at some of the resources that are out there in a little exercise, and then to take a break for 15 minutes, and what I want you to do is have a look at some of these resources and try a search in them, and you probably only have time in 15 minutes to maybe look at one clinical decision support resource such as Cochrane Library or Up to Date, and one of the lookup resources. Now, some of the lookup resources through QUT have got a user limit, 2 user limit or a 10 user limit, so you may find you get blocked out. So if that happens, just switch to one of the others. It looks like AusDI has no great limit. And when you have a look at them, just reflect, if you were a clinician using those resources in practice, have a look at how they work and how they might differ from something like a journal article that from the primary literature, and also the access paths that they would need to traverse to find what they need. And as Kate says, she's put up a doc in Google Docs which has got all the links if you're just wanting to click on a link and link out. So if we stop now, if we aim to come back at 5 past the hour, wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in, so basically 15 minutes, and if you've got any comments, you could maybe put them through the chat, and then we'll go on from there. But I think it's good to have a bit of a break, because it's just very tiring sitting still having someone speaking at you for 2 hours. Okay, so see you all in 15. Some comments through the chat. Looks like Rosanna had success in looking at them at least. That's good. Thank you, Rosanna. Multiple attendees are typing. Thank you. I was thinking of opening it up to people to use the microphone to speak, but I think it could get a little bit unwieldy. And oh, that's interesting. Anna's just had a look at Up to Date. That's good. It's a very expensive resource. Boolean skills, yeah. Okay, thank you, Stephen. Okay, well, I hope that's been useful, but there are a lot of resources. The first link at the top there on where it says take a 15-minute break, I found that probably the most useful way to navigate my way through to a lot of the resources that are available through the QUT site. So certainly have a go at looking at those and testing out a few others as well. I guess from my perspective, the sorts of things I think about in my library are that our websites need to focus on the needs of our clients, and what works in an academic library is not always the best display for a hospital library. And my observation in using the QUT library is, like a lot of the academic libraries, they push you straight through from the first screen through a discovery level search where it searches multiple resources simultaneously. And that's not necessarily in a hospital type environment the best way, because we're talking about people who are looking for particular sorts of information. They are very aware of what it is that they're after. They're not really looking for lots of stuff, and I think even in academic libraries there's recognition that discovery level searching, where it searches multiple resources, is useful for undergrads, but perhaps not so useful for postgrads or people studying for things like a PhD, where they need particular access to particular resources. So it's a bit horses for courses, and I'll give a little bit more of an explanation of some of the things we've discovered in our library. I see Cecily was trying the search for epistaxis, none in the Australian portal, a few in the US clearinghouse. So yeah, there's certainly yeah, so Leslie's saying, yeah, tell the research students to ignore the discovery layer. And when I was trying to find the resources to point you towards on the QUT site, I actually found it a little bit difficult until I found my way to that LibGuides page where they had a sort of an A to Z, which made it a lot easier. Up to date that Anna mentioned is particularly interesting, but I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Kate's even found it tricky. That's interesting. So, this is just a sort of some of the things that we went through in our library. Just it's our library's experience. So it might be useful, but as I say, it's horses for courses. You've got to analyse your own clients and their needs, and you've got to understand what they want, and then your solution may not be our solution, but this is what I think is our solution. So what we tried to do is give people access to everything that they use most frequently on the front page of the site. So in one click and they're at what they want. And that one click had to be to their most popular clinical decision support resources, to their lookup sources, in other words, especially their drug information sources, to their databases, but also to discovery level searching if they wanted that. But what works for one may not work for all. And as I say, the needs assessment is what's core, and that's, you know, any library can argue the case for how they've designed their site, and if it meets the needs of their clients, then that's what it needs to be. So this is the library site for our library, and it's a LibGuides generated site. As you can see, we're still on LibGuides 1. We haven't migrated to the latest LibGuides, but we will be shortly. And we've tried to link right on that very front page the drug and toxicology guides that they use most frequently, the clinical resources, things like Access Medicine, which includes probably the major textbook in medicine, Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, best practice from the British Medical Journal Publishing Group, Clinical Key from Elsevier, the guidelines portal from the NHMRC, Cochrane, Up to Date, and so on. And then the databases. And I see a question from Robin, is MIMS the most frequently used drugs resource? I think it possibly is by doctors, but pharmacists are a lot more critical of it, and they very much would prefer it if doctors just used AusDI and Australian Medicine's Handbook. But I know MIMS is heavily used. I think the pharmacist's view is that MIMS is too close to the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and that the information in AMH, Australian Medicine's Handbook, and AusDI is more independent. So, yeah, they're all used heavily, I will say that. All of them are used very heavily. All of those drug information, therapeutic guidelines is used very heavily. They're all used heavily. Everything's used heavily. And the way we think we've sort of got it right, and sorry, I should have also said, you can see under search that we have a discovery level one search there, but we also have tabs where they can switch to searching the catalogue, particularly books, journals, etc. Now, the reason we think that this sort of site works okay is when we look at the stats of use. The front page is hit incredibly heavily, and all subsequent lower down pages, not so much. So that to me says they're probably getting what they want. But having said that, just when you think you've got it right, we had a consultant from one of our, what they're called a general hospital, which is not the tertiary level hospital. We have tertiary level general hospitals, they're called in WA, and then specialist hospitals. And one of the general hospitals, which is, I guess, a large suburban hospital, has emergency department, has an intensive care, but it doesn't do the super specialty stuff that comes up to the tertiary level hospitals. But he came in and his comment was he needed some way to get his junior doctors to find the information he wanted them to find. And I said, well, it's all on the front page, isn't it? You know, like everything's there that they're going to want to need. There's a link to Up to Date, which is, you know, I thought they all loved incredibly, and in fact they do. It's got massive statistics of use, but he said he didn't like them using Up to Date, which was a bit disappointing considering we pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for it every year. But he thought that limited their problem solving and their thinking capacity. It's too pat, it's all too given up to them, that they needed to do more thinking about what they were doing. And they millennium, whatever the criticism is these days, they just want to get to an answer and they don't think things through. And, you know, it sounded like talking to your grandfather when he was quite a young consultant, so I was quite surprised. And his solution was he wanted a page where he told them what they had to look up. And I thought, well, that's very unusual. But we created him a page today. So if you have a look at our site later on under subject guides from the tab above, I think there's a link embedded in this presentation, and I think you're able to view the presentation again after tonight. There's a link to our site embedded in there, and in the subject guides tab, we've now created one called RGHED, where the 4 books he wants them to read are listed, along with the New England Journal video clips that he wants them to have a look at. So, and I guess that's the other great thing about using something like LibGuides for your site. If people come in and they've got particular sort of things that they want to do, if you can create it for them without compromising the overall structure of your library site, it's nice to be able to, you know, give them what they want. I'm still not particularly convinced that that's going to be the be-all and end-all of his problems, if he's got problems, but it was just an interesting little bit of feedback that came today, which it was actually the whole conversation with him stumped me. You know, I thought we were doing pretty well, as I say, but people have different views, and if you can respond to them, as I say, without, you know, I wasn't going to redo our site according to what one hospital consultant wanted it to be redone in the image of, but so we gave him basically a URL that's our standard URL / RGHED on the end, so Rockingham General Hospital Emergency Department. So it'll be interesting to see how many hits that page gets over time. So that's all I'll say about that. But I guess that's just a real world example of how people use your resources online and so on. And I guess while I'm looking at this page, I might just also comment on a couple of other types of things that you encounter in our environment. I don't know whether any of you have had a lot of demand for these ACORN standards, the Australian Council on Operating Room Nurses Standards for Perioperative Nursing. That's a resource that's been in heavy demand for years, but it's a resource that's published by the ACORN themselves, and they seem to team up with these agencies or with these companies that sell them a solution that's, you know, if they bothered to talk to a library, they would discover is no solution at all. So their first attempt was they partnered with a company called Lock Lizard to deliver the information, to deliver the standards. And frankly, it just wasn't networkable or usable or purchasable by a library because it required usernames and passwords, and It was just so clunky, it was unbelievable. And we just said to them, can't do it, we'll never buy it when it's like that, you know. And they've come up with something, it's still lock lizard, but it's a bit more open and it's a bit more usable. But that's, again, another real world example of resources that you might think would be out there and would be available because they're, you know, they're standards, they're Australian, they're in a sort of a critical area of perioperative nursing. You would think that they would be just so much a resource you would want to have, and they are, but they've got problems because of the way they're presented. So that's another interesting little thing that happens with health resources at times. There are other resources that are very popular. We've recently picked up also the Royal, you'll see under the news box, the Royal Marsden Manual of Clinical Nursing Procedures. And again, every clinical guideline I've ever seen nurses write cites the Royal Marsden Manual. So I don't know why they don't just point to the Royal Marsden Manual and stop trying to reinvent wheels, but they seem to reference huge chunks out of it for every clinical practice standard that they come up with. Anyway, that's my editorial comment. And we'll move on from that on to and I guess just to go back to the exercise, encourage you to have a look through the health resources that are available to you through the QUT library or through your own library. Just have a look at them, think about using them from the perspective of a clinician, of the people that you're serving in a health library. Another big group of literature that's quite important in health and medicine is the good old grey literature, which I'm sure you're familiar with from other environments as well. So that's the stuff that's put out by government agencies, universities, business industry, but it's not controlled by commercial publishers, and it can be quite hard to find. As it says, it's non-conventional. I love the word fugitive, and sometimes ephemeral, and definitely ephemeral. It can be a big problem there one day, gone the next. And they can be all sorts of things, as it says, reports, advanced reports, tech reports, stat reports, state-of-the-art reports, lots and lots of things, and some incredibly valuable information in them, you know, definitely worth hunting out, especially if you're doing things on health systems reform. They're the ones that, you know, we reform ourselves endlessly and do it several times over in a cycle of about 20 years. And I often wish people read the grey literature more frequently, because they might find that the latest trend that they're heading down has been done 10 years ago and it didn't work then, and why are we doing it now? So grey literature's, I guess, typically found with searches on things like Google, obviously, tracking down through agencies who you think may have actually produced it and searching directly in those agencies. It is important literature. And there are all sorts of sources that are particularly relevant. If I were looking for grey literature, I would certainly go looking directly in some of these sources, because they're some of the biggest repositories of that sort of information. So we already talked about the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ, in the US, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in Australia. Unfortunately, that agency, I thought, had been slated for closure by the government, but a whole pile of different agencies were due to close down and then reopen as one super agency. But so far, AIHW is still ticking along and still producing very good reports. They produce a report every 2 years called Australia's Health, and in the intervening year they produce one called Australia's Welfare, where they track trends in health status and health services, and the same with welfare issues in the welfare one. They produce workforce reports, they produce reports on various conditions, Aboriginal health, all sorts of things that they track there. It's a very good source for grey literature for Australia. The Institute of Medicine in the US is a very big agency, part I think it's been rolled up under some other agency now, but still can be found under Institute of Medicine. They did a very significant landmark report, I don't know how long ago, it must be about 20 years ago now, called To Err is Human, looking at patient harm that comes from patients being harmed from medical treatment and what needs to be done to increase patient safety and reduce the level of adverse events. And that's still quoted every time there's any report on patient safety, is that IOM report. The King's Fund in the UK produced a lot of work on health economics and health management, leadership. It's a very good source for, and they produce excellent reports, really excellent reports. They have blogs, they run conferences. And I think the next one's an interesting one, and if you haven't looked at that yet, I know it's a journal site, but it looks like the NHS has taken up the cudgel of deciding to research things that they think are important to answer questions in, you know, should we invest? They've got several different parts to that library, so some parts of it are looking at health technology assessment. So should we buy this latest machine that goes ping? Is it going to give the health system value? Is it going to save us money in other areas? So they do health technology assessment. They do a lot of health management research, you know, like is this structure the best way to evaluate something, or is this research methodology a good methodology for researching that? So it's not exactly grey literature because it is a journal site, but because it's not a traditional publisher, I put it into the grey literature site because I don't think it gets indexed. I forgot to check that. I don't think it gets indexed in the major databases, but it's really often very topical. If you get asked for something, you'll probably find someone's been asking that, 1999 To Her is Human. That is a long time ago. Thank you, Cecily. So you'll probably find that National Institute for Health Research Journals Library has commissioned and produced a paper on it as well. Nice that we already mentioned the National Institute for Clinical Excellence in the UK. The Nuffield Trust from the UK also produces a lot of good reports, a bit like the King's Fund, and RAND from the US, so the RAND Health Studies. There's quite a lot of studies that they do in health, and that's a really excellent source for grey literature as well. Okay, and I just realised why is this coming out? Oh, that's good. Did someone pick up on my typing errors? I think maybe Cecily may have picked up on my typing errors because I'm reading my summary of my slides and I realise I've got clinical trails everywhere instead of clinical trials. I strongly suspect, yeah, Cecily picked it up. Thank you. Clinical, I was reading it myself thinking, trails? What have I done there? Oh, I am glad. Thank you, editor. Yes, clinical trial registers. Okay. So these are a very important source of information for research to identify research that's already underway. So you don't want to sort of start a research project intending to recruit thousands of patients to try to answer a really important question only to get halfway or a quarter of the way into it and find that there's a multinational, multi-centre randomised controlled trial going on internationally that's got, you know, far more power than the study that you're going to do is ever going to have, and you've just wasted, you know, several months, if not years, of your research life. So before people begin to establish a clinical trial, you really need to know what other ones are out there. So there's clinical trials are now required to be registered, and they appear in various registries. So if you're looking to see if someone's asking you for information and they're saying it's a new area, there's nothing known on it, you may well want to look at clinical trial registers to see whether there's something underway that your person might want to contact those people doing the trial directly before they go down too many rabbit holes. There's an international clinical trials registry which draws data from all of the other national registries, so that you can have a look at that one as well. And the other reason that, not just to stop you sort of doing research that may already be underway, but it also, the other major reason that these registries are now being required to be, or trials are required to be registered in a registry, is because of the tendency in medicine for people to do a trial, discover that the results weren't what you expected, get disappointed and just forget about it, not publish any outcomes. So you're expecting to show that this marvellous drug cures cancer, you try it out in a couple of hundred people, it doesn't cure cancer, you just think, oh, that's a disappointment, and you shelve it. Well, it's actually important to know that it didn't work. And there's a strong publication bias, there's a positive, there's a bias in the literature that's out there that's overly optimistic about about all sorts of interventions, not just drugs. It could be surgical, it could be a talking therapy in mental health, it could be all sorts of things that people try. They tend to be very happy to publish where they get a positive outcome of their research, and then they don't typically report negative outcomes. And so if you're looking to find out whether, say you're doing a systematic review and you're looking to find, does what I'm doing cause what I think it's causing, or is it an artifact that something's happening? You know, is there a cause and effect relationship, or is it just sort of coincidental what I'm finding? You may well want to look in these clinical trial registers, because there could be all sorts of stuff in there where people have done it and found it absolutely didn't work, and therefore you don't really want to go down the road of conducting that research when, you know, it can alert you to the fact either they did it wrong, maybe they didn't do the research very well, or they actually, the negative results are correct, and you're going to get the same thing if you go down that road too. So that's they're very important for that reason, to counter publication bias in research. Okay, now we get to the database type sources. So where do you find information about the primary literature, about the base level of that 6S pyramid? Where do you find the primary literature? And there are obviously the big databases, PubMed, or sometimes you'll hear it discussed called Medline, and we'll talk more about that in the searching module. And sometimes they're used interchangeably, but there is actually a difference between PubMed and Medline. And I've put a link there to it, but I think I'll probably be going over that more with you when we talk about searching in the next modules. But Medline, everything in Medline is in PubMed, basically, but not everything in PubMed is in Medline. So PubMed is broader than Medline. So maybe just leave it at that for the minute, but we will be going over that again. So that's one of the major database sources. Embase is the other major one that's owned by Elsevier. And Embase is another medical database, very much like Medline. It has a big amount of overlap with Medline, but it has significant unique resources in it, because it indexes different journals. It indexes conference papers where Medline doesn't index those, and it is stronger in particular in the drug literature. So certainly if you're doing research that's looking for information about drugs, you really are advised that you should run the search in Embase as well as in Medline, but it's a good idea. Certainly if you're doing systematic review searching, it would be expected that you would search definitely in both of those sources. Other databases are CINAHL, a cumulative index to nursing and allied health literature, which is now an EBSCO hosted product. It has occasionally got some interesting problems with the way it exports results, and it has quite often lately seems to have had a few bugs, but it is still, if you're doing a search for nursing literature or allied health literature, it is still one of the core sources for that sort of searching. And PsycInfo from the American Psychological Association, obviously for the psychiatric, psychological, social work type literature. So they're major databases that you would use in searching if you were required to do a literature search to support your clients. There are others, Informit, which is an Australian collection. Have to admit we've just cancelled Informit in Western Australia, largely due to budgetary problems, but it also has some major structural problems such that you couldn't rely even on the Boolean searching to work effectively, and I think it was that more than the cost. We thought the cost wasn't that high, but you do expect a database to do what you think it's doing, and we found it wasn't doing what it should have been doing, so that was a bit unfortunate. I don't know whether other people have had much experience with that one. And then there's a UK-based one called Turning Research into Practice database, which pulls in data from all sorts of sources. I can't remember. I personally don't use that one very much, but I think it had a sort of a premium level that you had to subscribe to, and it had a basic level. I must admit I'm a little bit out of touch with that one myself. If anyone has any comments, you're quite welcome to make them. I'm obviously not as on top of that one as I probably should be. And then, of course, Web of Science, which we don't have access to in our library, but QUT does. So you can certainly use Web of Science from there. Robin's got a question. Because of budget restrictions, how does the library choose the most comprehensive or useful databases? Well, as I say, because we found Informit a little bit unreliable in the way it was searching, the Boolean just wasn't working, which is pretty basic in a database. I expect a database to work as a database. So when we found it wasn't doing that, and we didn't have high usage was another major aspect for us. It wasn't high usage. So basically it's usage and usefulness to our clients. That they were probably the two biggest things that were in our minds in terms of that database in particular. I guess there are other questions that come up these days as to whether you need databases at all, given that you've got, do you need Ovid or EBSCO or some other version of Medline, given that you've got PubMed? Certainly our librarians prefer to use Ovid. I personally prefer to use PubMed, but that's just because I've got used to it, and I generally only search PubMed. I don't do a lot of the searching for lit searches myself. When I have to do Ovid, I actually have to get advice from the librarians who work with me, because they're better at it than I am, quite frankly. And generally the other ones I would have to go back to would be searching something like Embase. So yeah, Web of Science, I guess some people would say that's a platform rather than a database. Yes, Cecily, so yeah, I thought that was the case, that Trip's got a free version but pushes the premium level, yeah. And then, of course, the discovery level sources, the things like Summon, Primo. We although ours is called OneSearch, we don't have Primo, we've got MetaLib Plus, which is, to me, the only difference is that MetaLib Plus still searches the Primo central index, which is great because that's the big central index. But it just means we can't point it to any local sources we might want to point it to, such as our catalogue. So it searches across databases, it searches across book platforms, it searches across publisher platforms, but it doesn't search our catalogue. But we think that that's not too bad. Stephen's asking why why Web of Science would not be considered a database. I think I've seen questions on that. I must admit again, I'm not so familiar with Web of Science because we don't have access to it normally unless I'm in this course. I did have a quick look at it the other day, but it was probably too quick to answer. But I have seen questions raised on an expert searching e-list where people were arguing the toss about whether Web of Science was a database or whether it was a platform. So maybe all I can suggest is have a go at yourself. The difference is if it's controlled vocabulary, and I think Web of Science doesn't have a thesaurus, it doesn't have controlled vocabulary, and I guess that's a distinction. Yes, and then the question about, yes, as Kate says, QUT is using summon. They all work a little bit alike, and certainly now summon is Serial Solutions. Serial Solutions was taken over by ProQuest, and ProQuest has just taken over Ex Libris, and Ex Libris's product was Ex Libris products are Primo and Metalib. So the market in discovery is shrinking, and so basically your choices are Summon from ProQuest / Serial Solutions, and or Primo Metalib, which is Ex Libris, which is also now owned by ProQuest. So the market's shrinking, or sorry, I should have said OneSearch from OCLC. And then there are probably various other, I don't know whether I've got a slide on that further in. I don't think I have. No. So, yeah, and the place of them, as I say, is sometimes debated, whether they've got a good role or not. Yeah, ProQuest or ProQuest. Okay. And then there are very specialised database sources. So these are particular, often clearinghouses, they're sometimes described as, or they suck up sources from a whole variety of different places. They may pull a data stream even out of something like out of PubMed, because PubMed gives their data away, and you can incorporate it and build on it with other data. So some of the portals, clearinghouse, I describe them, yeah. So Australian Indigenous Health is obviously an excellent source if you're looking for information on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. Care Search coming out of Flinders in South Australia, an excellent source for information on palliative care. Things like the Database of International Rehab Research, if you're after rehab information. A very interesting little one, I put this one in just as a little interesting one. It's not a great big thing, but it's the James Lind Library illustrating the development of fair tests of treatments in healthcare. So what works, again, is quite... oh yes, I see some useful comments about Web of Science used by a lot of researchers to measure impact. Yeah, yeah. Yes, H factors, yep. Alerts come through from Gradusnet. Sorry, Robin, I don't quite understand. Alerts come through from you can pick up mostly out-of-date literature. When alerts... I don't understand that one, but if you want to type some more, I'll try to come back to that. Then there are all sorts of other sources, such as, very intended for particular audiences. So Occupational Therapy Seeker, OT Seeker, Pedro, a database specifically aimed at physiotherapists. Again, these are all sort of began as that whole evidence-based movement took off, and SpeechBite. Those three all seem to be built on the same platform. So speech pathology basically is SpeechBite. So they've got a very particular client group in mind for the way they're developed. And then there's lots and lots of very specialised databases, things like ToxNet, LactMed, Genomics. The National Library of Medicine has a great many sources of databases on very, very specific topics, so lots to look at there as well. And then there are sort of general search engines out there on the internet. There's one called Mednar, which is a medical search engine. Yeah, again, whether they're all that useful, it's really up to you to have a look at them and evaluate them. I think this one's quite a nice one, Find Zebra, because rare diseases are quite difficult to find information on, and so that's a nice little search engine particularly aimed at rare diseases. So Robin's saying GratisNet sends libraries listings of articles that are free from health libraries. No, there you see, I didn't know that. Thank you, Robin. And of course Google Scholar, which of course we hear quite often is the go-to source for lots of people, certainly in academic libraries. I don't hear it so much in our hospital-y type environment, but it may well be going on, and I'm just not that aware of it. Now, powering all of these, or some of these databases, the ones that have controlled vocabulary are built, of course, on having good thesaurus to provide that controlled vocabulary and that greater precision in searching. And in Medline, it uses, you'll hear this term mentioned, MESH, medical subject headings. And they're the subject headings of the thesaurus that's used particularly by that database. Embase has its own database called Mtree. Mtree is built on MESH, but they tend to change a few things. So where MESH might have inverted headings like leukemia, comma, aplastic or whatever, in Mtree they would call it aplastic anemia or whatever. So there are differences, is what I'm saying, between the two, even though one's built on the other one. Rosanna, I like to show Google, especially when it links to full text. Yes, that's true. If you can embed your get it at or your find it at, that certainly makes Google Scholar a lot more useful, I think, to people than just using it where they then have to work out how to proxy their links to get to the full text, or to, you know, go back to an A to Z to navigate their way through to something. Certainly, if you're at a university or at a library where you've been able to do that integration with Google Scholar of your own proxies, that definitely makes it much more useful to people, I think. Some of the other thesauri that are used are PsycInfo's got its own thesaurus of psychological index terms, and CINAHL again is based on MESH, but it's MESH plus whatever CINAHL has added to it. Obviously, fleshing out terms in the nursing and allied health area where they think MESH is not adequate to describe some of those concepts. Okay. Certainly not great at the week where the full text linker between Google Scholar and La Trobe broke. Yeah, you heard about it then. Yes, I bet you did. Okay. Now we've sort of reached the base of the pyramid literature, so the 6S pyramid down at the base with the books and the journals. So we talked about all sorts of resources up till now. We've talked about particular types of resources, guidelines, clinical trial registries. I keep wanting to say trail now. Grey literature, all sorts of things, databases. But of course, at the base of it all is are the journals and the books. And it's known that sort of publishing in this sort of field in health and medicine is known as STM Publishing, Scientific, Technical, Medical. Sometimes you see it called STEM these days, I've seen as well, Scientific, Technical, Engineering and Medicine, I think it is. But generally STM Publishing. And there's actually an association for STM, the Global Voice of Scholarly Publishing. It's quite an interesting website to look at, and they track trends in scholarly publishing. So of course at the moment a lot of the discussions going on around scholarly publishing are about open access and opening up the literature more. And that's a really major trend, is open access publishing, and there's an entire e-list, Australian Open AOA or something, Australian Open Access list that I recommend if you've got an interest in open access issues, because STM publishing, due to the costs involved, because STM publishing is the most expensive publishing, much more expensive than stuff that gets published in the humanities, but it's just about collapsing under the weight of the costs these days, as I'm sure most of you know from your own organisations. And there's a bit of a transition to open access, but we're in that very messy period where we're not there yet by any means. Okay, so Kate's saying some students did an assignment on open access repositories in health libraries. Really interesting to see just how many there are. Yeah, I know we've been asked, could we do a repository of our staff publications, but again, people use that term very lightly, and I was somewhat cautious because I have a feeling they expected sort of the world, and I thought our capacity to deliver, if they weren't going to give us the resourcing and the platforms to build it on, were pretty minimal. So I've been sort of dampening down expectations a little bit and trying to educate the people who think, oh, that sounds like a bright thought, let's have a repository, that they need to think it through a bit more in terms of what it might mean. And, you know, if they just wanted this, we could do that within existing resources. If they think they're going to get that out of existing resources, they're wrong. So it's a bit of a management of expectations, because there's no point starting down a road. Yeah, and as Kate says, sustainability is going to be a big issue. And Cecily's put the Open Access Support Group, that's the one, yeah. Really interesting emails come out of that one, and I recommend that one to you if you've got an interest in that. I guess I have an interest in it because I have to pay the bills and I have to justify the budget, and I have to try to educate people endlessly that, you know, yes, we're expensive. No, I'm not wasting money. Yes, it is required. And, you know, yes, we do have to have these resources if you want to be serious about the sort of organisation you want us to be. So I keep a close eye on all that sort of stuff. Just having another drink. And the other side of it is that there are a lot of standards around this sort of publishing, and they're governed by standards that are set by an International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which is something also that you need to be aware of. That I think there's you'll see that mentioned quite a lot. A lot of journals will just simply refer to that as their standard. Yes, we abide by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. What they say is what we want in our journal. And Leslie's got a question: with our book purchasing, do we have a policy regarding format? We're a little bit unusual where we are, Leslie, because we're a new hospital. I'm based at Fiona Stanley Hospital in Murdoch in Western Australia, and that hospital opened with a philosophy of being paperless in all areas, including ours, which was interesting. We did manage to, we have got one room. We are very book light, I'll tell you that. We're very online heavy because we haven't got anywhere. Well, we've got an enormous space, but we've got almost no shelving to put anything on. So our policy is if we can get it online and it's the sort of resource that is going to get used online, we'll buy it online, but we do know that there's still a huge demand for print. So we try to buy the books, like that. We try to buy the multi-volume Campbell's Orthopedics and Brenner and Renner's The Kidney. We try to buy those 3-volume ones that no one wants to lug around anyway online. But we buy the MCQs and the study guides for MRCP study type books, which we try to buy the ones that are in demand in print. So that's and basically we're going to be limited by space because we haven't got anywhere to put them. So we're going to have to. We've got literally, I think we've got one. We've probably got I can't remember how many bays, but probably only about 12 bays of shelving. So it's tiny. It's in a cupboard basically. So that's the policy, determined by circumstance that we were forced into, I'm afraid. Okay, how we go? Oh, we've only got 5 minutes left. Okay, I don't have all that much more to go, so I think we'll get through it. As well as the traditional publishers who publish, the books, the journals, and so on, obviously there are also aggregators out there in the market, and they aggregate collections of journals and so on. And the big ones in journals are ProQuest and EBSCO, and I think they all also have collections of, yes they do, they all have collections of books, as does StatRef. StatRef's a collection of books. Now, for journals, our strong preference is not to buy from an aggregator if it's a journal we really care about, because they often are slightly delayed in the aggregator getting hold of the content. They often have embargoes, and so you have to be careful what you're buying when you buy an aggregator package. It may look like you're getting a lot for your dollar, but when you go into it, do you get the online early? Do you get do you get everything in there in a timely fashion? Is there any embargoes on what you're getting? Does the content suddenly disappear one day because the publisher's pulled it from the platform, and does that matter to you? And if you answer yes, to that, then you're really better off trying to get as much as you can directly from a publisher site, in my view. But it does sometimes come down to budget, and quite frankly, people often like the interface of the publisher site more than they don't like being pushed through an aggregator at times, we've found. Okay, and then I guess another thing it's useful to know in our environment is who are the major publishers in our field, and probably these ones would constitute the major STM commercial publishers. There are a whole pile of, obviously, of what they call society publishers. So again, the American Heart Association, the Cancer, American Cancer, ACA, I can't remember, just renewed their subscription, but yeah, the cancer bodies, the association publishers basically are the other big sort of big group, but all American Pediatrics Association for the pediatrics. So they might have 4 or 5 of their own journals, and you buy them as a package. And obviously these big publishers publish packages as well, and you can generally these days their stuff is sold in packages. I better get a wriggle along, I just realised what the time is. I've only got 2 slides to go, so we're not too far from being finished. And I guess always you're having to answer what's core. I think, was it someone asked me that question earlier, how do you decide what's your policy? There used to be a thing called the Brandon Hill list of core titles for a small medical library. That was taken over by a commercial product called Duty's Core Titles, and you can buy access to Duty's Core Titles, and they will tell you what they think are core. It is American, so they may not think a British book, these are book titles I'm talking about, oh, I think they do list journals as well. I can't remember. I haven't looked at duties for a while. But they will tell you what they think are core in every specialty. And but you do have to supplement it with British and Australian stuff because then they're a bit light on in that area. There are various reading lists that are issued by accrediting medical colleges or universities. So if someone's training to be a radiologist, they will have a list of references that they expect their radiology students to have access to. Same for the physicians, the surgeons, and so on. There are guidelines on practice-specific issues. So I mentioned this one earlier, list of reference texts for pharmacists that comes out from the Pharmacy Board of Australia that mandates thou shalt have access to at least one of these and at least one of those, that sort of thing. So they can be quite helpful if you're moving into health and you don't have the background and you're not sure, you know, who says we've got to have this sort of thing. Those sorts of sources can be very useful. As you can see, there's a lot of literature out there. There's databases, there's journals, there's books, there's grey literature, there's guidelines, there's decision support tools, there's particular resources, things like UpToDate, Dynamed, those sorts of resources. Some are bread and butter, but it really depends on where you're working, what sort of clients you have, what the need is in your local environment, and the only person who can answer that is you in your library working with your clients. So that pretty much sums it up, and in the next two sessions we're going to be talking about searching, in particular the databases, and how to do that effectively. So, and we've finished on 6 o'clock. That was pretty good timing. So thank you all for your comments all the way through. It really does make it great to have that interaction. And I know it can be quite difficult just sitting and listening, and I'll have to see if I can come up with some extra good things for you to do as exercises through the next couple of weeks. And do you have any questions?
Having the anecdotes and the examples from your own particular situation and your background, it's added quite a lot to our understanding. We may know the names of these products, but hearing what's ranking high and what's not getting much use is really valuable. Thanks.
That's okay. Yeah, it's there's one library's experience. I'm sure a lot of you have, those of you who already work in health probably already have views on a lot of these things, but if you're new to it, I hope I've covered the major points for you.
I think you've probably motivated us all to go away and have a look at some of those resources which are maybe not so well known, but also some newer ones. And I'm really, each time I hear about some of these new tools, I make a resolution to give them a try, and I'm sure I will this time. I hope other people are feeling inspired.
Thank you.
We're getting lots of thank yous on the chat box too, so that's lovely. All right then, I think that maybe people have got lots of food for thought tonight, and it may just be that we're going to have a very interesting week with people exploring the resources that are there. If there's no particular questions coming through, perhaps we ought to leave it at that for this week, and we will reconvene next Wednesday, ready to hear about specifically searching PubMed.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.